The soft clink of a spoon against china was the only sound in the room after Christopher Aldridge finished speaking. Then Louisa's voice cut through the silence, calm, clear, and completely certain. I don't think that's right. 8 years of marriage. 8 years of sitting beside the most powerful landowner in Virginia and saying nothing. But that evening she challenged him once and picked her spoon back up. Then a second time on a different matter entirely. Then a third, 3 challenges. 3 silences that fell over the table like stones dropped in still water. And after every single one, she lifted her spoon and kept eating her soup. By the end of that supper, nothing at Aldridge Hall would ever be quite the same. If you've ever been underestimated by the person who was supposed to see you, clearly this story is for you. Stay with us. Subscribe to the channel, because Louisa Aldridge is just getting started. The wedding supper at Aldridge Hall had been everything Virginia society expected it to be. 3 long tables stretched the full length of the formal dining room, draped in white linen and heavy silver that had been in the Aldridge family since before the Revolution. Candles burned in rows of 12. The Remington family sat to the left, the Aldridge relations to the right, and between them, in the center chair at the head table, sat Louisa Remington, now Louisa Aldridge, in a gown the color of cream, with her mother's pearl earrings at her throat and her hands folded so quietly in her lap that no one would have guessed they were trembling. She was 22 years old. She had known Christopher Aldridge for 8 months. He was 31, the sole heir to 4,000 acres of the finest tobacco and grain land in the Shenandoah Valley, a man whose name carried the kind of weight that other men leaned into when they walked into a room. He was not unkind. That was what her father had told her. He is not unkind, Louisa. He is simply accustomed to having things his way. What her father had failed to mention was that having things his way included, apparently, disappearing from his own wedding supper. It happened just after 10 o'clock. Louisa had been speaking with his aunt, a dry-voiced woman named Mrs. Hartwell, who smelled of lavender and asked too many questions about Louisa's needlework. She had not been watching Christopher particularly. She had no reason to. He was at his own table, at his own celebration, surrounded by men who laughed at everything he said. Then one of the housemaids appeared at the edge of the room. Not hurrying, not drawing attention, but moving with the particular careful deliberateness of someone who had been given instructions and understood the importance of following them exactly. The maid crossed to Christopher's chair, bent close and said something near his ear. Christopher didn't flinch, didn't pause his conversation. He set down his glass, touched the corner of his mouth with his napkin, and stood with the easy manner of a man excusing himself to check on the horses. He said something brief to the man beside him. Louisa couldn't hear the words from where she sat, and then he walked out of the room. She waited for him to return. He didn't. 20 minutes passed. Then 40. Then the candles had burned down another inch, and Louisa's mother had leaned over twice to ask if she was all right, and Louisa had smiled both times, and said she was perfectly fine, and the lie had come so naturally that it frightened her a little. At 11:30, one of the grooms, a boy named Ellis, who had clearly drawn the short straw among the stable hands, appeared at the side door of the dining room. He had the look of a man walking toward a fire. He found the head housekeeper, Mrs. Patton, and said something in a voice so low that Louisa would not have caught it at all if the room hadn't shown that exact moment to fall briefly quiet between songs. "Mr. Aldridge has ridden out," Ellis said. "He said not to wait on him." Mrs. Patton's face went the color of old wax. She looked immediately toward Louisa. Louisa was already looking back at her. The room, in the way of rooms full of people trying very hard not to have noticed something, continued to hum with carefully manufactured conversation. But Louisa felt the shift move through it like a cold current under still water. The glances that cut away too quickly, the sudden fascination with wineglasses and tablecloths. Her mother's hand finding hers under the table and squeezing once hard. Louisa did not squeeze back. She picked up her fork. She finished her supper. The pork was good. The sweet potatoes had been done with brown sugar and a trace of something smoky she couldn't quite name. The bread was soft, and there was a honey butter that Mrs. Patton had likely made herself, because it was the kind of detail that Mrs. Patton was meticulous about. Louisa ate all of it. She asked for more bread. She accepted a second glass of wine. And when her father came to stand behind her chair with his jaw set in that way, That meant he was holding back an entire speech. She looked up at him with calm, clear eyes. "I'm fine, Papa." "Louisa, I'm fine." He stood there another moment. Then he sat back down. She knew what they all assumed. They assumed she was humiliated. They assumed she would weep in her room tonight, or rail at the servants, or write a furious letter to Christopher's uncle demanding an explanation. They assumed that a woman in her position left at her own wedding table on her wedding night would be broken by the insult of it. They did not know Louisa Remington. She was not broken. She was paying attention. She was learning exactly who she had married. Christopher returned at 4:30 in the morning. Louisa knew because she heard the horses. She was awake. She had been awake since midnight. Not from weeping she had not wept, but from thinking, which was a habit her mother had always called unladylike, and her father had always called her finest quality. She heard him in the corridor outside their chamber. She heard him pause at the door. The pause lasted a long time. Then he opened it. The room was dark except for the low ember of the fire she'd kept burning. She was sitting in the chair by the window, still in her wedding dress, because she had refused to let the maid undress her before her husband came home. That had seemed at the time like the only boundary she could draw. Christopher stopped when he saw her. He looked, and she would remember this for the rest of her life, not guilty. Not ashamed. He looked briefly, startled, as though he had expected the room to be empty and had found instead something he didn't know how to account for. "You waited up." He moved further into the room. He'd taken off his coat somewhere, and his cravat was loosened, and he had the look of a man who had been somewhere warm and pleasant, and had not thought about the cold ride home until he was already in it. "You don't need to explain." He stopped. That startled him too, she could see it. "It is our wedding night," he said, carefully, the way a man speaks when he's testing the ground beneath his feet. "Yes." Christopher, her voice was quiet. It did not waver. "I said, you don't need to explain. I mean that. I'm not asking you for an explanation tonight." "What are you asking for?" She looked at him steadily. "Honesty. Not tonight. You don't owe me honesty tonight, since we barely know each other. But eventually. When you're ready to understand that I am not one of the things in this house that simply holds its place and waits to be used." She stood up then, smoothed the front of her dress, and walked to the bedroom door. "I'll have Martha come help me dress for bed. You can take the chair if you'd like. The fire won't last another hour, but I'll have someone bring more wood in the morning." She didn't wait for his answer. That was the beginning of the 8 years. What people in Shenandoah County saw, over the years that followed, was a marriage that looked entirely ordinary from the outside. Christopher Aldridge managed his land. He made decisions. He rode out in the mornings and came back in the evenings with the satisfied look of a man who had moved pieces around a board and liked where they'd landed. He hosted suppers twice a month at which the local gentry ate his food and drank his wine and agreed with most of what he said. He was respected. He was not loved exactly, but respected, which in Virginia in 1810 was worth considerably more. Louisa ran the house. That was how everyone described it. She runs the house beautifully. The Aldridge hospitality is entirely her doing. She's very capable for a woman who came from a smaller property. What they did not see, what Christopher himself, if he was honest, did not see clearly enough, was what running the house actually meant. It meant knowing that Thomas Elliott, the grain tenant in the North Field, had a wife expecting their 4th child in February and had been a week late with his autumn rent for the past 3 years without fail, but had always paid by December every time without being asked twice. It meant knowing that the mill lease arrangement with Joseph Carey was generating significantly less revenue than the acreage warranted, and that Carey had quietly extended his own storage agreement with a merchant in Harrisonburg without disclosing it to Christopher. It meant knowing which of the field managers could be trusted to report accurately and which ones rounded their numbers in whichever direction they thought Christopher wanted to see. It meant knowing, in other words, nearly everything that happened on 4,000 acres of Virginia land. Because people told things to Louisa that they did not tell Christopher, because Louisa listened without making them feel judged for needing to speak. She never brought any of it to Christopher directly. She had tried once, in the 3rd year of their marriage, when she had discovered that one of the overseers was systematically underreporting crop yields and pocketing the difference. She had sat down with Christopher after supper, laid out the figures, and explained what she had found. Christopher had listened. He had nodded. And then he had said, with a gentleness that was somehow worse than impatience, "Louisa, I appreciate you taking an interest. But this is estate business. Leave it to me." He had handled it, eventually dismissed the man 6 months later, after his own accounting finally caught the discrepancy. He had never mentioned to Louisa that she had been right. She had learned from that. She had learned to keep her own books quietly in a ledger she kept in the drawer of her writing desk. She had learned to build what she knew carefully, over time, so that when the moment came to use it, she would not be speaking from instinct or concern. She would be speaking from evidence. She waited 8 years for the right moment. It arrived on a Tuesday evening in October. The supper that night was not a small family meal. Christopher had invited 4 men. George Whitmore, who managed a neighboring property and controlled most of the grain contracts in the northern half of the county. Samuel Pryor, a lawyer from Staunton who specialized in land transactions. Daniel Marsh, Christopher's oldest friend and a man whose opinion Christopher valued primarily because Daniel always agreed with him. And a newcomer, a man named Harlan Voss, who had arrived in the county 6 weeks earlier with considerable money. A letter of introduction from a merchant in Richmond, and a smile that Louisa had distrusted on sight. Voss was the kind of man who made himself pleasant in a way that required constant quiet effort. He had learned to say the right things at the right moments. He knew how to make other men feel clever without appearing to flatter them. He had a way of leaning forward when he spoke that conveyed attention, investment, the sense that whoever he was listening to was the most important person in the room. Louisa had watched him for 6 weeks. She had also quietly written a letter to her cousin in Richmond, who had a sharp mind and connections in the merchant community there. The reply had arrived 4 days ago. She kept it in the drawer with her ledger. The supper conversation began, as these suppers always began, with farming, with weather, with the mild complaints of men who had more than enough but preferred the posture of men who were managing carefully. Christopher sat at the head of the table. Louisa sat to his right, which was her place. She ate and she listened. And she said the things that women said at these suppers, small courteous remarks about the food, brief questions that allowed the men to keep talking. Then Christopher set down his wine glass and said, "I've been thinking about the tenancy rates." The table settled into attention. "The grain prices have been soft since spring. The margins are tighter than I'd like." He said it with the calm of a man who has decided something and is now informing the room. "I intend to raise the tenant rents by 15% beginning in January." Whitmore nodded slowly, the nod of a man performing careful consideration that he'd already completed before he arrived. "It's a reasonable adjustment given the climate." Pryor said nothing, which was his way of agreeing. Daniel Marsh said, "Makes sense to me, Christopher. Can't carry the difference forever." Voss smiled his careful smile and said nothing at all, which Louisa had come to understand was his most deliberate move. He never pushed. He let other men do the pushing. He simply made himself available to benefit from whatever they decided. Christopher looked satisfied. The look of a man who has said the thing he intended to say and found it received exactly as he expected. Louisa put down her spoon. It was a small sound, a silver spoon against a china bowl. Nothing that should have drawn attention. But it drew Christopher's. He looked at her. 15%, she said. Her voice was even. In January. Thomas Elliot has 4 children now. The youngest was born in August. He lost a third of his corn crop to the early frost. The table went quiet in a particular way, not the quiet of emptiness. The quiet of men who have heard something unexpected and are waiting to see what happens next. Christopher's expression had not changed, but something behind his eyes had shifted. A kind of alertness, Louisa. "I'm not contradicting you." She picked up her wine glass but didn't drink from it. "I'm asking if you've looked at the figures for January specifically." "Not the year overall. January, I've looked at the figures." "Elliot's January figures or the property figures?" Silence. "Because they're different," she said. "The property figures look fine. But Elliot's January figures, his, specifically show a man who is going to be unable to pay you in January whether the rate goes up or not. And if you raise the rate and he defaults, you'll spend more recovering the tenancy than you would have earned from the increase." Christopher was looking at her the way a man looks at something. He thought he understood, and has suddenly realized he may not. How do you know Elliot's specific figures? His wife asked me for advice about household management in July. We talked for 2 hours. A pause. People tell me things, Christopher. They always have. Daniel Marsh cleared his throat. Pryor examined his fork. Whitmore had gone very still in the studied way of a man deciding whether to pretend he's not listening. Voss, across the table, was watching Louisa with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not the pleasant attention he gave everyone else. Something sharper. More careful. Christopher was quiet for a long moment. We'll discuss this later, he said. His voice was even. Of course, Louisa said. She picked her spoon back up. She finished her soup. And the thing she felt, sitting at that table with 4 men, and a husband who had never once asked her what she thought, the thing she felt was not fear. It was clarity. She had waited 8 years to find the right moment to speak. She had been patient. She had been careful. She had built her knowledge like a wall, stone by stone, until it was solid enough to stand on. And now she was standing on it. What happened next would depend on Christopher. But she was done being quiet. The men stayed another hour after supper, the way men do when they have wine left and opinions they haven't finished delivering. Louisa excused herself and withdrew to the small sitting room off the main parlor, her room, the one she'd made her own over 8 years, with the low fire and the good reading lamp and the writing desk, where her ledger lived in its drawer. She lit the lamp. She opened the drawer. She set the ledger on the desk, and beside it the letter from her cousin in Richmond. Her cousin's name was Margaret, and she had married a man who dealt in land contracts along the James River and had, over the years, developed a very clear picture of how deals were structured in Virginia's merchant class. Louisa had asked her simply to find out what she could about Harlan Voss. Margaret had found out quite a bit. Voss had come from Fredericksburg, not Richmond as he'd implied. He had held 2 previous land interests, both of which had dissolved under circumstances that involved, in the first case, a boundary dispute that had ended in his favor, after documents surfaced that 2 of Margaret's husband's associates considered irregular, and in the second, a tenant arrangement that had resulted in significant profit for Voss and significant loss for the man whose acreage he'd managed. He was not a swindler in any way that could be easily proven. He was simply a man who had a talent for placing himself adjacent to other people's decisions at exactly the moment when he could benefit most from the outcome. And 6 weeks ago, he had placed himself adjacent to Christopher Aldrich. Louisa read the letter again, slowly, the way she always read things when she was deciding what to do with them. Then she folded it and put it back in the drawer, underneath the ledger. She needed to understand what Voss wanted from Christopher before she could understand how to stop it. She had one suspicion. She needed one more supper to confirm it. Christopher came to the sitting room before 10. He stood in the doorway for a moment, the way he always did when he came to find her there, as though the room itself required a kind of permission to enter. She had never quite decided if that was habit or instinct. 8 years, and there were still things about him she was still working out. The men have gone, he said. I heard the horses. He came in and sat in the chair across from her desk. He didn't say anything immediately. That was Christopher's way, he thought, before he spoke, which was one of the things she had come to respect about him, even in the years when she had struggled to respect much else. You embarrassed me tonight. Not angry. Flat. In front of Whitmore and Pryor and Daniel. Would you have preferred I ask it privately? I tried that once. You told me to leave the estate business to you. A pause. That was 4 years ago. 5, she said. And the answer's still the same, so the number doesn't much matter. He looked at the desk, at the ledger which she had not closed when she heard him coming. She'd left it open deliberately. The numbers were visible if he chose to look. He didn't look, Louisa. I need to understand something. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on knees, in a way that made him seem younger, less certain. Are you doing this because you're angry with me? About the way things have been between us? She considered the question. She gave it the weight it deserved, which was more than he was probably expecting. No, she said finally. I'm not angry with you about the way things have been. I made peace with that a long time ago. A brief pause. I'm doing this because the decision you announced tonight is going to cost this family money, and the man sitting across from you at supper has something planned that is going to cost this family more. And someone needed to say so. Christopher was very still. What do you mean, something planned? She looked at him steadily. I mean that Harlan Voss has not introduced himself to every significant landowner in this county because he finds Virginia architecture charming. He's looking for something. And I think I'm not certain yet, but I think he's found it in you. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious observation. There's a difference. She closed the ledger. I'm not accusing him of anything yet. I'm telling you to be careful. I'm telling you not to make any significant decisions that involve him until I've had a chance to show you what I know. Christopher stood up. He moved to the fireplace and stood there with his back to her for a moment, hands behind his back, the way he always stood when he was thinking something he wasn't sure how to say. You keep a ledger, he said finally. I do. For how long? 7 years. The sound he made was not quite a laugh. Not quite anything else. It was the sound of a man recalibrating. And you never told me. I tried to tell you once. You told me to leave the estate business to you. He turned then, and the look on his face was something she hadn't seen before. Not anger, not embarrassment. Something more complicated. Something that might, with time, turn into something she could work with. Show me what you know. She opened the ledger. And for the first time in 8 years, Christopher Aldridge sat down across from his wife and listened. He was not good at it at first. He interrupted twice with objections. She let him finish both times, then continued. She did not raise her voice. She did not soften her numbers to make them easier to hear. She laid out what she had. Methodically. The way she would have laid out a household inventory with precision. And without apology. By the time she reached the notes about Voss, he had stopped interrupting. By the time she finished, the fire had burned low and the clock had moved past 11. Christopher sat back in his chair. He looked at the ledger with the expression of a man looking at something he has walked past every day for years, and finally tonight stopped to really see. The Elliott situation, he said slowly. You're right about January. I know, the rate increase needs to be staggered. January is too soon for the Northfield tenants. If you push it to April and reduce the initial increase to 8%, you'll actually collect more over the course of the year than you would with a January 15. The ones who can't make January will default, and recovery costs you more than the difference. He nodded slowly. She could see him working it through. And Voss, she said. Don't do anything about Voss yet. Let him come to you. He will. He's been working towards something since he arrived, and he's patient. But he won't be patient much longer. When he makes his move, I need to be there. Why? She looked at him steadily. Because you need a witness who understands what he's doing. And because he doesn't think I understand anything. A brief, cool pause. That is currently our greatest advantage. Christopher was quiet for a long time. Then you've been running a shadow account of this entire estate for 7 years. I've been paying attention for 8, she said. I started writing it down after the first year, when I realized no one else was going to. Another long silence. Why didn't stop? Started again. I understand that I told you to stay out of it. But why didn't you push harder? Why didn't you? Because I wasn't ready, she said simply. And because you weren't ready to hear it. She closed the ledger for the second time. People only hear things when they're capable of hearing them. I've been waiting for you to be capable. He looked at her. And this time, the thing on his face was something she recognized. Because she had seen it once before on their wedding night, when she had been sitting in the dark in her wedding dress, and he had walked through the door and found her there. He had been startled then. He was startled now, because he was, she realized, only just beginning to understand who he had married. We'll talk more tomorrow, he said. He stood, and for a moment he seemed uncertain what to do with his hands, with the space between them. 8 years of practice distance didn't dissolve in a night. Yes, she said. He moved toward the door. At the threshold he stopped. Louisa. A pause. Long enough that she looked up. You were right, he said. Tonight at the table. You were right to say it. She held his gaze. I know, she said quietly. But thank you for saying so. He left. She sat for a moment in the low light, her hand flat on the closed ledger. 8 years. She had sat at that table for 8 years. And she had listened. And she had watched. And she had built her knowledge into something solid and true. And tonight she had picked up her spoon and put it down and said 4 sentences, and the most powerful landowner in the Shenandoah Valley had come to her sitting room at 10 o'clock and asked her to show him what she knew. It was a beginning, not a resolution, not a triumph. A beginning. She understood the difference. There was still Voss. There was still the question of what he wanted and how far he'd already gotten, and whether Christopher could be made to see the full shape of it before Voss made his move. There was still, underneath all of it, the question of whether the man who had ridden away from his own wedding table 8 years ago was capable of becoming a man who could stand beside her. She didn't know the answer to that yet, but she was for the first time in a long time willing to find out. She blew out the lamp. She put the ledger back in the drawer. And when she went to bed that night, she slept. The next morning came cold and gray, the kind of October morning in Virginia that feels like the land itself is making a decision about the season. Louisa was up before Christopher, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that she came down to breakfast with the Richmond letter in her pocket. She had not slept as soundly as she'd expected. She had lain awake in the middle hours, thinking about Voss not with fear, but with the particular focused attention she gave to problems that required more than one move to solve. He had been in the county 6 weeks. He had attended 4 dinners, 2 Sunday services, and 1 informal gathering at Whitmore's property. He had said almost nothing at any of them that could be held against him. He had simply been present, and pleasant, and available, in the way of a man who understood that the best position to occupy was the one directly behind the person making the decision. Christopher was already forming an opinion of him. She had seen it at supper, the way Christopher listened when Voss spoke, the almost imperceptible lean forward, the small nod. Christopher was not a foolish man, but he was a man who trusted other men of apparent substance, because in his experience, men of apparent substance generally were what they appeared to be. Voss was not. She needed Christopher to understand that before Voss made his move. And she needed him to understand it without feeling like he was being managed, because the one thing she had learned about Christopher Aldridge in 8 years was that the moment he believed he was being handled, he became immovable. She was still working out the approach when he came downstairs. He stopped when he saw her at the table, a brief hesitation, the kind that would have been invisible to anyone who hadn't spent 8 years reading the small pauses between his decisions. Then he came and sat down across from her, which was not his usual place. His usual place was at the head. He sat across from her, and she understood that as the gesture it was. "You slept," he said. She passed him the coffee. "Did you?" "Not particularly." Set down the pot. "I've been thinking about what you said, about Voss. I expected you would be. You said to wait. To let him come to..." "Yes." How long the word came out with more edge than he probably intended. Christopher did not like waiting. It was the quality in him that she thought most likely to get him into trouble, not malice, not arrogance, but impatience dressed up in the confidence of a man who had always been able to make things move by pushing them. "Not long," she said. "He's been here 6 weeks and he hasn't asked you for anything yet, which means he's nearly ready." Men like Voss don't wait past the point of comfort. They make their approach when they feel they've established enough goodwill to make refusal awkward. Christopher looked at her across the table with that new expression again, the one she still didn't entirely have a name for. It sat somewhere between recognition and recalibration, and it was the most honest thing she had seen on his face in years. "How do you know that?" "Because I've watched 4 men like him come through this county in the time we've been married." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "They all move the same way. They arrive with good introductions and modest manners. They attach themselves to the most stable property in the area, and they wait until the timing is right. The difference with Voss is that he's better at it than the others were." "Better how?" "He never pushes. The others always pushed, eventually got impatient, showed their hand. Voss is still pulling back when other men would be pressing forward. That makes him more dangerous, not less." Christopher was quiet. She could see him weighing it, not dismissing it, which was something, but testing it against his own read of the man, trying to find the place where her assessment and his experience lined up or didn't. "He seemed straightforward enough to me," he said finally. "He seems straightforward to everyone. That's the point." Another pause. "The letter from your cousin," he said. "Can I read it?" She'd expected the question. She took the letter from her pocket and put it on the table between them. He read it twice. She watched him. His expression didn't change much. Christopher had a landowner's poker face. The product of decades of negotiations across tables, where showing too much could cost you, but she saw the slight tightening around his eyes when he reached the part about the dissolved land interest in Fredericksburg. Irregular documents, he said. Margaret's husband's words. He's a careful man, very. Christopher folded the letter and set it down. He did not hand it back to her, and she left it where it was. All right. He said we wait. She nodded once. He looked at her directly. When he comes, I need to be the one who handles it. You understand that? She looked back at him with equal steadiness. You can handle it, she said. But I need to be in the room. A beat of silence. Because he doesn't think you understand anything, Christopher said slowly, repeating her words from the night before. Because the moment he realizes I understand everything, she said, is the moment he's already lost. Voss came to the house 3 days later. He came on a Thursday morning between 9 and 10, which was when Christopher was typically in his study reviewing the week's accounts. Louisa was upstairs when she heard the knock, and she heard Mrs. Patton admit him, and she heard the brief exchange of pleasantries in the front hall in Voss's particular smooth baritone. She came downstairs 12 minutes later. The timing was deliberate. Early enough to seem natural, late enough that the conversation would already be underway, the first positions already taken. She had found, over the years, that the most useful moment to enter a negotiation was not at the beginning, when everyone was still performing, but slightly after, when the performance had settled into something closer to intent. She knocked at the open study door. Christopher looked up. So did Voss, who rose from his chair with the fluid politeness that was his most polished quality. Mrs. Aldridge. The smile was warm and immediate. What a pleasant surprise, Mr. Voss. She came into the room and took the chair near the window, not the chair beside Christopher, but the one that let her see both of them without being centered between them. I hope I'm not intruding. I needed to speak with Christopher about the linen order, but it can wait. Not at all. Voss settled back into his chair with the ease of a man who was comfortable making himself comfortable anywhere. We were just discussing the county, actually. I was telling your husband about a situation in the western parcel you may have heard. The Fairfield property is coming available. Louisa kept her face pleasantly neutral. The Fairfield property. She had not known that specifically, but she had suspected something in the western acreage. The pattern fit. I hadn't heard, she said. Has Mr. Fairfield decided to sell? Decided is perhaps strong. Voss's tone was delicately rueful, the tone of a man who regrets having to deliver inconvenient information. I understand he's under some financial pressure, the kind that tends to resolve itself one way or another by the end of the year. That's unfortunate, Louisa said. It is. Though of course it does present an opportunity for the right buyer. His eyes moved to Christopher with the practiced casualness of a man who has planned exactly where he wants his eyes to move. Someone with the capital and the existing infrastructure to absorb the acreage meaningfully. Christopher leaned back in his chair. Louisa could see him doing what he always did when he was interested, assuming a posture of studied neutrality that was meant to convey that he was thinking it over, but had not yet formed an opinion. She had watched that posture for 8 years. She knew what it meant. He was already considering it. What's the price? Christopher asked. Fairfield is motivated, Voss said. I think a serious offer made quickly could be very advantageous. That was not an answer, Louisa noticed. She suspected Christopher noticed too, but the excitement of the prospect had already gotten into him the way it always did, that faint energy of a man who can see the shape of a thing and wants to move toward it. It would need survey work, Christopher said. The boundary with the Miller easement is complicated. I've actually had some preliminary conversations with a surveyor I know from Fredericksburg, Voss said smoothly. A very reliable man. I could arrange for him to come out next week if you're interested. There it was. Louisa set down the small piece of needlework she'd picked up from the side table. She always kept something at hand for these moments, something to make her presence seem casual, and looked up. That's very thoughtful, Mr. Voss, she said pleasantly. Though I'd think Christopher would want to use William Stover for the survey. He's done all the Aldridge boundary work for 12 years. The continuity of records is important when you're working near a complicated easement. A very small pause. Voss's smile did not change. That was what told her she'd hit something, not a flinch, not a shift, but the deliberate non-change of a man who had trained himself not to react. Of course, he said. Just a thought. A kind one, she said, and went back to her needlework. Christopher was looking at her. She did not look back. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes. Voss talked about the Fairfield property with the generous looseness of a man in information rather than selling it, which was the most effective way to sell something. He talked about the western acreage's water access, its proximity to the main road, its existing tenant structures. He painted the picture with just enough specificity to make it real, and just enough vagueness to make it feel like an opportunity that might close at any moment. When he finally rose to leave, he shook Christopher's hand with the warmth of a man who considers himself already a partner rather than a supplicant. At the door, he turned to Louisa. "Delightful as always, Mrs. Aldridge." The smile again full and easy. "You have a very fine mind for these matters." "I'm just interested in my husband's affairs," she said simply. Something moved behind his eyes. Fast and quickly Coopered. "As any good wife should be," he said. He left. The silence, after his horse cleared the drive, was the particular charged quiet of two people who had just done something together without quite saying so. Christopher spoke first. His surveyor would file his own records, Louisa said. Independent of the county office. When the boundary dispute came, and it would come, that Miller easement has 5 different interpretations, depending on which surveyor you ask. Voss's man's records would be the ones on file. Not Stover's. Christopher stared at the door where Voss had been standing. "He's done this before," he said. "Not a question. Twice that my cousin could document." A long breath. "The Fairfield property, is it genuine?" "It may be. Fairfield has had a difficult 2 years, that part's true. I've heard it myself. But whether the price Voss has in mind, the price Fairfield has in mind, is a different question." She put the needlework down entirely now. "And whether Voss has a private arrangement with Fairfield, a finder's percentage, a side agreement, is yet another question." "You think he's getting a cut?" "I think he's positioned himself between a motivated seller and a well-capitalized buyer, and that those positions are worth money to a man who knows how to use them." She paused. "I think you should have Pryor look into Fairfield's actual situation independently, without mentioning Voss. And I think you should ask Stover very casually, when you see him, whether anyone from Fredericksburg has contacted him about the western acreage recently." Christopher was still. "Why Stover?" "Because Voss offered his own surveyor before you'd expressed serious interest in the property." "Which means he's already planned that part." "Which means he's either approached other surveyors in the county, or he's already spoken to Stover and been turned down." She folded her hands. "Either way, Stover will know something." The silence this time had a different quality. Heavier. The kind that comes when a man is revising something fundamental about how he understands a situation. 4,000 acres, Christopher said, almost to himself. "And it never occurred to me," he stopped. "It occurred to me," Louisa said. Not unkindly. "That's why I kept the ledger." He turned to look at her then fully. In the way he hadn't quite managed to do since the night before, not the half-glance of a man caught off balance, but the direct attention of a man choosing to see something clearly. "I owe you an apology," he said. The words landed with more weight than she'd expected. She had not expected them at all, if she was honest. "Not for this specifically," he continued. "For the first year. When you tried to show me the overseer situation, and I told me to leave the estate business to you." "Yes," he held her gaze. "I was wrong to do that." Louisa was quiet for a moment. She gave the silence the respect it deserved. Because these words from Christopher, not hedged, not qualified, not dressed up as something more comfortable, were not nothing. They were the first honest reckoning she had heard from him in 8 years. "I know you were," she said. "But I also know I wasn't ready then to show you what I know now. The knowledge I had at year 1 would not have been enough. It took 7 years to build what I showed you last night." "That's generous." "It's accurate," she said. "Both things can be true." He exhaled slowly. He sat back down in his chair, not the posture of negotiation this time, but the posture of a man who has set something down and doesn't know quite what to pick up next. "What do we do now?" he asked. And she noticed it the way you notice the first warm day after a long winter, not as surprise exactly, but as a shift in the quality of the air that you feel in your chest before you can name it. "Now we wait," she said. Pryor will need 3 days to look into Fairfield quietly. Stover, I can speak to myself. I see his wife at the market Thursday. And she talks more than he does anyway. A small pause. In the meantime, you don't avoid Voss, but you don't advance anything either. You tell him the property is interesting, but you have prior commitments to review before you can look at anything new. He'll push. Let him push. The moment Voss pushes is the moment he loses the advantage of patience, and patience is his best quality. She stood smoothing her skirt in the habitual way she'd had since she was a girl. A man who's lost his best quality is just a man. She moved toward the door, then stopped. Christopher. He looked up. The tenancy rates. Will you look at the January figures again before you make the announcement? Elliot specifically. Yes, he said, I'll look at them. She nodded once and left him there. Thursday's market proved more useful than she'd anticipated. Ruth Stover was a comfortable, broad-shouldered woman who had been married to William Stover for 23 years and considered it her particular gift to know everything that happened in a 10-mile radius before it happened to anyone else. She was also, critically, a woman who trusted Louisa had trusted her since the year. Louisa had quietly arranged for the Stovers' eldest daughter to receive the tutoring she needed to secure a position as a governess in a good household. A fact which Ruth had never forgotten and which she expressed in the form of unfailing candor whenever Louisa asked a question. The man from Fredericksburg, Ruth said, without preamble, when Louisa had gently worked the conversation in that direction. Harlan Voss. William came home from that conversation in a mood I haven't seen since the time someone tried to file a claim on the Henderson Creek boundary. Louisa kept her pace steady. Voss approached him 3 weeks ago. Wanted William to take a private commission survey the Fairfield Western line and file the documentation directly with him, rather than the county office. Ruth's voice dropped, though there was no one near them. William told him to go straight to the devil. William's exact words were somewhat more specific than that, but you understand the sentiment. I do, Louisa said. He wanted private documentation. His own copies, his own records, filed outside the county system. A pause. Louisa. Your husband is interested in that property, isn't he? Not quite a question. He may be considering it. Ruth stopped walking. Louisa stopped with her. Then you need to know this, Ruth said. Voss has already approached Fairfield. William knows because Fairfield's brother-in-law uses William for his own survey work, and he mentioned it in passing. Voss has a verbal agreement with Fairfield, a percentage of the final sale price, above a certain threshold. The higher the price Fairfield gets, the more Voss earns. Louisa took that in. So Voss benefits from Christopher paying more. Voss benefits from Christopher paying quickly and paying high. The urgency he's creating Fairfield's financial difficulty, the implication that the property might go to another buyer. Ruth shook her head. William thinks Fairfield is actually in as much trouble as it's being presented. There it was. The piece she'd been missing. Not just a finder's percentage. A constructed urgency. Voss had manufactured the pressure that would make Christopher move fast and pay too much, and he would collect a premium on the difference. She needed Pryor's findings to confirm the Fairfield financial picture. But she trusted Ruth Stover's accounting of her husband's accounting, and William Stover had not been wrong about a boundary question in 23 years. Thank you, Ruth, she said quietly. You watch out for your husband, Ruth said with the directness of a woman who has earned the right to say such things. He's not a bad man, he just doesn't know what he doesn't see. I know, Louisa said. I'm working on that. Pryor's letter arrived Saturday afternoon. It was brief and careful in the way that Pryor's communications always were. He was a man who said exactly what he meant to say and nothing more, which was the quality that made him a good lawyer and occasionally an exhausting dinner companion. But what he said was enough. Fairfield's financial situation was not critical. It was uncomfortable. There were debts, there was pressure, but it was the kind of uncomfortable that a decent crop year would resolve without requiring a land sale at all. The motivation that Voss had implied was largely manufactured. Fairfield himself, Pryor noted at the end of the letter with uncharacteristic sharpness, had recently made inquiries about extending his northern tenant agreements, which was not the behavior of a man planning to sell his property. Louisa read the letter at her writing desk. She read it twice. Then she put it in the drawer with the Richmond letter and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the ledger. She had what she needed. The question now was how to use it. She could bring it to Christopher directly, lay out the full picture, and let him handle Voss in his own way. That was the simplest approach, and part of her wanted to put the evidence in his hands and step back, to let the thing resolve itself cleanly without requiring her to be in the room when it happened. But she had seen how these things went when men handled them privately, between themselves, with the polite fictions of business preserved. Voss was good enough that he would find an explanation for every piece of evidence she had, individually. He would turn Ruth Stover's account into hearsay. He would turn Pryor's letter into a misunderstanding of Fairfield's circumstances. He would turn the Fredericksburg history into an unfortunate misrepresentation by people who didn't understand the full situation. He needed to be exposed fully, all at once, in front of people whose opinion Christopher respected. He needed to have no room to construct a retreat, which meant she needed another supper. She went to find Christopher. He was in the study, and when she came in, he looked up with that quality of attention that was still new enough to feel like a gift. "I have what I need," she said. She put both letters on the desk. He read them. She watched his face and saw the thing she had been waiting for, not anger, which would make him reactive, but something colder and more useful. The look of a man who has understood the full shape of something and found it considerably less impressive than it was trying to be. He manufactured the urgency, Christopher said. Yes. Fairfield's not actually in trouble. Not critically. And Voss has a percentage arrangement with Fairfield on the sale price above threshold. The higher you paid, the more he earned. The quiet in the room had an edge to it now. How do we handle said? And again she sat down. Invite him to supper, she said, this week. Invite Whitmore and Pryor as well. Pryor because he already knows the Fairfield situation. Whitmore because he controls the grain contracts in the northern county. And Voss has been cultivating him too, I've seen it, and Whitmore deserves to know what Voss is. Christopher was very still. You want to do this publicly. He made himself credible publicly. He needs to lose that credibility the same way. She held his gaze steadily. And I need to be the one who does it. Not because I need the satisfaction of it, but because if it comes from you alone, Voss will say there was a misunderstanding. He'll be gracious and aggrieved, and half the table will be uncomfortable and uncertain. If it comes from me, he'll underestimate you, Christopher said slowly. He already does. That's been his mistake since he sat down at our table. She paused. Let him make it one more time. Christopher looked at her for a long moment. Long enough that she felt the weight of all the years in it, all the suppers she had sat through, all the ledger entries she had made in silence, all the mornings she had come downstairs knowing exactly what she knew and understanding exactly why she couldn't say it yet. All right, he said. He reached across the desk and he put his hand over hers. It was the first time in 8 years that Christopher Aldridge had reached for her like that, not the formal gestures of a man performing a husband's duties, but the simple, deliberate contact of a man who is choosing to close a distance he had allowed to grow too wide for too long. She did not pull away. She did not, in that moment, let herself think about the wedding night, or the 8 years of careful distance, or the ledger in the drawer that represented everything she had understood and held alone. There would be time for all of that. There was work to do first. The supper, she said. Thursday, said. I'll send the invitations today. She nodded. Her hand stayed under his a moment longer. Then she stood and went to write out the menu and began to plan for the thing that Thursday was going to require from her. Because Harlan Voss was coming to her table, and this time she was going to make sure he understood exactly whose table it was. Thursday arrived, the way important days often do, without fanfare, without any outward inside it would matter more than the hours before. The morning was ordinary. Christopher reviewed the week's accounts. Louisa spoke with Mrs. Patton about the supper arrangements. The kitchen smelled of roasting meat and fresh bread, the way it always did before a dinner. And if any of the household staff sensed that something was different about this particular evening, they kept it to themselves. Louisa dressed carefully, not extravagantly. That was important. Extravagance would signal preparation, and she did not want Voss to feel prepared for. She chose the dark blue wool, the one with the cream collar, the one that Christopher had once said, years ago in a moment of unusual candor, made her look like a woman who knew what she was about. She had not forgotten that. She had worn it twice since, both times when she needed to feel like a woman who knew exactly what she was about. Tonight qualified. She sat at her writing desk for 20 minutes before the guests were due to arrive. Not reviewing the letters, she had those memorized now. Every detail. Every implication. Every thread that connected to every other thread. She sat because she needed the quiet. She needed to feel the steadiness beneath the plan, to make sure it was still solid, to make sure she was still solid. The thing she was about to do was not small. She was going to expose a man in front of the people whose opinion mattered most to his position in this county. She was going to do it without warning, without giving him room to prepare a defense, and she was going to do it in her own dining room, at her own table, in front of her husband. If she was wrong about any piece of it, if Pryor's letter was mistaken, if Ruth Stover had misunderstood, if the Richmond information had gaps she hadn't accounted for, the damage would not just be to Vaughn. It would be to everything she had spent the last week carefully building with Christopher. She was not wrong. She knew she was not wrong. But she held the knowledge the way you hold something fragile carefully, with both hands, aware of what dropping it would cost. She heard the first carriage arrive. She closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then she stood, smoothed the front of the blue wool, and went downstairs to greet her guests. Pryor arrived first, which she had half expected. He was a man of precise habits, and one of those habits was arriving before the hour rather than at it, on the theory that a man who arrived exactly on time had clearly been waiting somewhere nearby, and that was slightly undignified. He shook Louisa's hand with his customary brevity and accepted a glass of wine with his customary expression, which suggested he found wine adequate, but would prefer to get on with things. Whitmore came next, with his wife Eleanor, a quiet woman who had been friends with Louisa since the early years of the marriage, in the undemanding way of women who live near each other and share enough values to make the friendship low maintenance. Eleanor squeezed Louisa's hand at the door and said the house looked lovely, and Louisa thanked her and meant it less than she usually would have, because her attention was already at the door. Daniel Marsh arrived with his eldest son, a young man of 20 who had recently returned from schooling in Philadelphia and had the slightly dazed quality of someone who had seen a larger world than he knew how to integrate yet. Christopher greeted them in the front hall with the easy warmth he reserved for old friends, the warmth that Louisa had always privately thought was the truest version of him. The version that existed before he remembered to be the most powerful landowner in the county. He always came last. She had realized, watching him across 4 social occasions, that it was a tactic arriving after everyone else meant walking into a room already full of people who had to know, rather than waiting in an empty room for people to trickle in. It positioned him as the arrival rather than the waiter. It was a small thing, but small things, assembled carefully, built the architecture of an impression. He came through the door with exactly the right amount of ease, not too casual, not too formal, carrying a bottle of wine from somewhere specific enough to be noteworthy without being ostentatious. He greeted Christopher first, then Pryor, then Whitmore with a warmth that suggested genuine pleasure at seeing him specifically. Then he turned to Louisa, Mrs. Aldridge, the smile. The particular quality of attention that he gave to whoever he was addressing, that sense of being seen and valued. "Thank you for the invitation. I've been looking forward to this." "And so have I," Louisa said pleasantly. "Please, come in." She watched his eyes, just for a moment, the briefest scan, the kind of automatic assessment that a man like Voss performed on every room he entered. He was reading the table, the guest list, the arrangement of the evening. She saw the small relaxation that moved through him when he completed the read and found nothing unexpected. That relaxation was the last comfortable thing he would feel tonight. The supper began as these suppers always did, carefully, pleasantly, with the managed sociability of people who had been raised to understand that the dinner table was a performance as much as a meal. Christopher sat at the head, Louisa to his right. Voss had been placed across from her, between Whitmore and young Marsh, which was deliberate. She wanted to be able to watch him without appearing to watch him, and she wanted him to be able to watch at her without being sure what she was thinking. The first course came. The conversation moved through the county news, the road conditions, the early frost damage, a dispute between 2 families in the southern part of the valley over a fence line. Voss contributed appropriately to each topic. He was good at this, knew when to add a word, when to ask a question that made the speaker feel clever, when to laugh at the right moment. He had the social intelligence of someone who had spent years studying how to be easy in a room. Louisa ate her soup. The second course arrived. Christopher mentioned, with the studied casualness they had practiced, that he had been thinking about Western acreage and whether the Fairfield situation might present an opportunity. Voss's attention sharpened, imperceptible to anyone who wasn't watching for it. But Louisa was watching for it. I was going to mention that myself. Voss offered, with exactly the right amount of restraint, not pouncing, just confirming. I believe the timing could be quite favorable. How favorable? Pryor cut in with the bluntness that was either his habit or his version of help. What's the actual ask? Fairfield hasn't named a figure publicly. Voss was smooth as river water. But for a buyer with Christopher's standing, I suspect a conversation would move quickly. Based Pryor's voice was still entirely conversational. I understood Fairfield's situation was more stable than the season's rumors suggest. A very small pause, so small that Whitmore and Daniel Marsh would not have noticed it. Louisa noticed it. They're always different readings of a man's circumstances, Voss said. I've had some direct conversations with Fairfield that suggest the pressure is more significant than the public picture. Direct conversees, said. Her voice was light. Interested. The voice of a woman asking a clarifying question because she is genuinely curious, not because she is placing a stone in the road. Voss looked at her, the pleasant attention. That's right. How direct? She tilted her head slightly. I ask because I spoke with Martha Fairfield at the Whitmore gathering last month, and she mentioned they were planning to extend the North tenant agreements into next spring. That seemed like a decision you'd defer if you were genuinely planning to sell. The table registered this in the way of tables that are skilled at registering things without appearing to. Voss's smile did not flicker. Tenant agreements are often kept in place during a sale process to maintain property value. It's standard. Of course, Louisa said agreeably. I'm sure Mr. Pryor can speak to that. Pryor looked up from his plate with the expression of a man who has been handed exactly the question he came prepared to answer. Actually, from a legal standpoint, extending tenant agreements during an active sale process is quite unusual. It creates complications with transition. Most sellers in genuine financial difficulty do the opposite. They let agreements lapse to simplify the transfer. Voss took a slow breath. She could see him doing it. Not enough to be visible to the table, but enough to tell her that he was adjusting. Perhaps Fairfield's situation is more nuanced than either interpretation covers, he said carefully. Perhaps, Louisa agreed. Which is why I asked William Stover to look into the property records last week. Now the table did notice. Not dramatically, not the sharp silence of a revelation, but the slight shift of attention, the small stillning of movement that happens when people understand that something important is being said. Voss looked at her. For the first time since she had met him, his expression was not performing anything. It William Stover, he said. He's done all our survey work for 12 years. Very thorough. She picked up her wine glass but did not drink from it. He mentioned that someone from Fredericksburg had approached him recently about a private commission. Surveying the Fairfield Western line and filing the documentation independently outside the county office. A pause, soft as a door closing. He turned it down, of course. William is very particular about record integrity. Whitmore had gone very still across the table. Daniel Marsh was looking at Voss with the particular focused attention of a man who has understood that he is watching something real unfold and is not sure which direction it will fall. I don't know what Stover thought he was being asked, Voss said. His voice had not lost its smoothness, but the smoothness now was the smoothness of effort rather than ease. A private commission isn't inherently irregular. No, Louisa said pleasantly. But filing documentation outside the county system is, particularly when the property in question borders a disputed easement, particularly when the person commissioning the work has a percentage arrangement with the seller that increases with the final sale price. She set down her wine glass. Because that would mean you benefit directly from the buyer paying more. And private survey records that bypass the county office would make any subsequent boundary dispute much easier to resolve in the direction that benefits whoever filed the original documentation. The table was entirely quiet now. Not the polite quiet of people pretending not to the real quiet of people who have stopped pretending entirely. Voss looked at Christopher, and this was the moment she had planned for, had held in her mind through every step of the past week, because the look on Christopher's face was not confusion. It was not uncertainty. It was the cold, flat clarity of a man who has already reviewed the evidence and is now watching the confirmation arrive in real time. Christopher Voss started. I think there's been a significant misunderstanding. Has there? Christopher's voice was even. Not loud. Not heated. The voice of a man who has no need to raise it. Because my wife has just described the same arrangement that my lawyer confirmed independently this week. And she described it accurately in every particular. A pause that sat heavy as a stone. So help me understand what's been misunderstood. Voss looked around the table. Whitmore was watching him with an expression that had moved from still to something harder. Pryor was looking at his plate with the studied neutrality of a man letting a thing resolve without his assistance. Daniel Marsh's son was trying not to stare and failing. And Louisa was looking at Voss with the calm attention of a woman who has been waiting a long time for its exact moment and finds now that it has arrived that she does not need it to be dramatic. The arrangement with Fairfield, Voss said carefully, is a standard finder's fee. There's nothing improper about it. A finder's fee is disclosed, Pryor said without looking up. To all parties. Silence. Was it disclosed to you, Christopher? Pryor asked. It was not, Christopher said. Another silence. Voss set down his fork. It was the first uncontrolled movement she had seen from him, not calculated, not positioned. Just set down, the way a man sets something down when he needs his hands free to think. I had every intention of disclosing it before any formal offer was made, he said. This is a mischaracterization of the timeline. Then let's establish the timeline, Louisa said. You approached Mr. Stover 3 weeks ago about a private survey commission. You began representing Fairfield's financial situation to my husband as critical approximately 5 weeks ago. If you intended to disclose the arrangement before an offer was made, at what point exactly? Did you plan to do that? No one at the table had ever heard Louisa Aldridge speak like this. She could feel it, the recalibration happening in real time, the collective adjustment of every person present to the fact that the woman they had understood to manage Christopher's household was managing something considerably larger than that. Voss did not answer immediately. When he did, the pleasantness was gone. Not replaced by anger, he was too controlled for anger, even now, but by something more honest, which was the look of a man who has realized the ground he was standing on has already been removed. I came here in good faith, he said. I've conducted myself throughout these conversations in good faith. If there's been a misunderstanding about the nature of my arrangement with Fairfield, I'm willing to clarify it to everyone's satisfaction. Clarify it now, Christopher said. Another pause. The arrangement with Fairfield is a standard commission. 5% of the final sale price above the threshold value, paid by Fairfield upon closing. Voss's voice was steady. He had found his footing again, or was working hard to appear that he had. I disclosed it to Fairfield's solicitor. The expectation in these transactions is that it flows through for the seller's disclosures, not through my direct representation. And the private survey commission? Louisa asked. A precaution. Certain surveyors in this county have relationships with parties who might have competing interests in the western acreage. His eyes moved to Whitmore very briefly, just briefly enough. I wanted clean documentation. Whitmore's jaw tightened. Are you suggesting? Whitmore said slowly, with the particular deliberateness of a man choosing his words around his temper, that you sought private documentation because you didn't trust the established survey system in this county? The system that I have relied on for 20 years? I'm suggesting nothing about your integrity, Voss said carefully. I'm saying that in any transaction of this size, independent documentation is prudent. Independent and private are different things, Pryor said. He was looking up now. Independent would mean choosing a different certified surveyor and filing through the county system as required. Private means bypassing county records entirely. Those are not the same thing, and a man of your experience knows that. The air in the room had changed completely. Voss looked at his plate. He looked at Christopher. He looked finally at Louisa, and this look was different from every other look he had given her. There was no pleasantness in it, no performance, just the direct assessing gaze of someone who is trying to calculate how badly this has gone and finding the number worse than expected. Mrs. Aldridge, he said, and his voice now had an edge that his voice had never had before. You've clearly done a great deal of research into my affairs. I've done a great deal of research into my husband's affairs, she said quietly. which is what I should have been permitted to do from the beginning. But that's a separate conversation. The correction landed cleanly. She felt Christopher shift slightly beside her. This is not how I envisioned this evening, Voss said. No, I don't imagine it is. A long, terrible silence. Then Whitmore put down his napkin. Christopher, Whitmore said, I'll be honest with you. Voss approached me about the Fairfield situation as well. 6 weeks ago. Said the same things motivated seller, good timing, significant opportunity. His voice had the flat quality of a man reporting a fact he's not pleased to be reporting. I didn't move on it because I have enough western acreage and the Miller easement has always made me nervous. But I should have told you he'd come to me too. A pause. I'm telling you now. Voss looked at Whitmore with a stillness that had nothing left in it. Christopher looked at Voss. How many other landowners in this county have you approached about the Fairfield property? He asked. No answer. Voss. I've had conversations with several people, Voss said carefully. That's standard in this kind of. 4. The word sat there. 4 landowners. 1 motivated seller whose motivation was at least partly manufactured. 1 private survey commission that had been declined. And a finder's percentage that had never been disclosed to the buyers being courted. Louisa watched her husband's face. Christopher Aldridge was not a man who expressed anger publicly. He had grown up in a house where the most cutting thing a man could do was lower his voice rather than raise it, and he had absorbed that lesson completely. He sat at the head of his table now, with his hands folded, and his voice entirely level, and that levelness was the most powerful thing in the room. I think, Christopher said, you should finish your supper. A pause. And then I think you should leave. Another pause. And I think you should understand that I will be speaking with the other 3 landowners you mentioned tomorrow morning, so that they have the same information my wife saw fit to give me. Voss sat for a moment. He cut a piece of meat. He put it down again without eating it. The performance of composure, stripped of any audience that believed it. You're making a mistake, he said quietly. I've made several in my life, Christopher said. Fortunately, I have someone who helps me see them clearly. His eyes moved to Louisa, briefly and then back. This particular one I won't be making. Voss stood. He was too controlled to storm out. He folded his napkin with deliberate care. He said something brief and formally polite to the table, the way a man says something he has rehearsed for exactly the possibility of public failure. He shook no hands on the way out. The door closed behind him. The dining room held the particular silence of a storm that has passed through faster than expected and left everyone standing in the clear air on the other side of it. Eleanor Whitmore was the first to speak. Well, she said, in the mild, unruffled tone of a woman who has been present for enough dinners to know how to move one forward. Shall we have the next course? The table breathed. Whitmore let out something that was almost a laugh. Pryor refilled his wineglass for the first time all evening. Daniel Marsh's son looked like he had just witnessed something he planned to tell people about for the rest of his life, which was accurate. Louisa reached for her soup spoon. She finished her soup. It was what she'd planned to do, and she did it calmly, with the same steadiness she'd had when she set it down and picked it up again at that first supper 2 weeks ago, when this had all begun. Across the table, she was aware of the shift in how people were looking at her. Not dramatic, these were Virginian landowners and their wives, and dramatic reactions were considered gauche, but there. The small recalibration, the quiet addition of something new to their understanding of Louisa Aldridge. Whitmore caught her eye and gave a small, slow nod. She returned it. Christopher did not say anything to her during the remainder of the supper. He didn't need to. He spoke to Pryor about the Fairfield situation and what, if anything, needed to be done through proper legal channels. He spoke to Whitmore about coordinating conversations with the other approached landowners. He was doing what he'd well, taking information and turning it into action, making decisions with the confident momentum of a man who has a clear picture of what needs to happen next. But 3 times during the meal, his hand found hers briefly under the table. Not possessively, not apologetically. The simple, deliberate contact of a man who is choosing again to close the distance. Each time she let him. The guest left just after. Eleanor kissed Louisa's cheek at the door and said nothing beyond good night, which was its own kind of eloquence. Pryor said he would send a formal letter to Fairfield's solicitor Monday morning, copied to Christopher. Whitmore paused on the steps and turned back. "You've been running this county without anyone knowing it," he said to Louisa. Not accusatory. "Almost wondering I've been paying attention," she said. He considered that. "Is there?" He put on his hat. "Seems the same to me." He walked to his carriage. Louisa stood in the doorway until the last wheels cleared the drive. Christopher came to stand beside her. They stood there for a moment in the night air without speaking, which was its own kind of conversation, the comfortable kind, the kind that only exists between two people who have stopped needing to fill the silence with performance. "For landowners," he said finally. He would have moved on to more. "I know." A pause. "Whitmore." I should have noticed he'd approach Whitmore too. "You had no reason to look for it. I had you telling me to look." She turned to look at him. "You listened when it mattered," she said. "That's not nothing." He was quiet for a moment. "Louisa." His voice had a quality she didn't often hear, and it stripped of the landowner, the decision-maker, the man accustomed to commanding the room. Just his voice, in the dark, honest, in a way that had been a long time coming. "The night we were married, when I came home at 4:30. She waited. "I knew it was wrong," he said. "I knew it before I left. I knew it the moment I made the decision, and I made it anyway because I had always made the decisions and assumed the consequences would be manageable." He paused. "That has been, I think, my fundamental problem. In this marriage, and in this estate, and in most things." She held his bin. She said steadily. "Yes." He didn't flinch from it. "I'm not asking you to forgive it tonight. I'm not asking you to forget it. I'm just saying I know it. I've known it for longer than I've been willing to say." The honesty of it was like a window opened in a closed room. She had not expected this. She had expected the gratitude for tonight, the acknowledgement of what she had done, the professional respect of a man who has seen his partner demonstrate competence he hadn't credited. She had not expected this, the reckoning with the beginning, with the thing that had made 8 years of careful distance necessary. She was quiet for a long moment. "I sat that table," she said finally, "at our wedding supper, and I finished my food and I decided 2 things. The first was that I would not let you destroy me. The second was that I would not let you destroy yourself either, if I could help it." A pause. "Those 2 things have driven most of what I've done since then. Including the ledger. Including the ledger." He looked at her in the dark, and she felt the weight of all the years in it, all the nights they had moved through this house in careful parallel, all the suppers she had sat through, knowing more than she was permitted to say, all the mornings she had come to her writings and added another line to the account of what she understood and what she was waiting to be ready to use. "I want to do better," he said. "I want to do considerably better than I have done. And I don't know exactly what that looks like. But I know it starts with asking you what you think before I announce what I've decided." Louisa looked at her husband. She thought about the woman in the cream wedding dress who had sat in the dark and listened to the horses disappear down the road. That woman had been very young and very afraid, and had made herself very still so that the fear wouldn't show. And she had spent 8 years becoming someone who didn't need to make herself still, because she had built the stillness into something real, into knowledge, into patience, into the moment tonight when she had put down her soup spoon and picked it up again, and everything had changed. "Then start now," she said. "What do you think we should do about the Fairfield property?" "Not through Voss. On our own terms." The corner of her mouth moved. "The property itself is worth looking at," she said. "Not at Voss's price, and not on Voss's timeline. If Fairfield is under real pressure, even less than Voss represented, he may be open to a fair offer made directly, without a middleman taking a cut." A pause. "Give me a week. I'll find out what he actually needs. Not what Voss told us he needs. What he actually needs." Christopher nodded slowly. "And Elliot," she added. "The January rate change. You said you'd look at his figures." "I looked at them yesterday. You were right. April at 8%. She felt something ease in her chest, something that had been held carefully for a very long time. "Good." They stood there a moment longer. "Come inside," she said finally. "Mrs. Patton will have left something warm in the kitchen. We can go over the Fairfield situation properly if you'd like." "I would like that," Christopher said. She turned and went inside, and he followed, and the door closed behind them both. And for the first time in the 8 years of their marriage, the house felt like it held the right number of people. The week after the supper was the quietest week Aldrich Hall had known in years. Not the quiet of emptiness, the house was as full of its usual rhythms as ever. The kitchen running. The staff moving through their duties. The field still demanding attention in the particular relentless way that land demands attention regardless of what is happening inside the house that sits on it. But there was a quality to the quiet that was different. Something had shifted in the walls of the place. The way pressure shifts before weather changes, and everyone who lived and worked inside those walls felt it without being able to name it. Christopher rode out each morning as he always did. But he came back earlier, and when he came back, he came to find Louisa. That was new. The first morning, he appeared in the doorway of the sitting room at 10:30, still in his riding coat, and said, Whitmore spoke to the other two landowners Voss had approached. Both of them had been told the same story about Fairfield's situation. Neither of them had moved on it yet. Louisa looked up from the ledger. Good. Did either of them know about the percentage arrangement? No, they're both unsettled, Whitmore's word. He came fully into the room. He said to tell you that he owes you a debt he doesn't. She turned a page. He would have figured it out eventually, maybe. But not before Voss had found someone willing to move quickly. A pause. She looked up. Warren Elliott. Christopher's jaw tightened slightly. Not Thomas Elliott, the tenant. Warren Elliott, the grain factor from Culpeper. Whitmore thinks Voss approached him first, before he started working the local landowners. And Warren Elliott has connections to a merchant bank in Philadelphia. Louisa set down her pen. This was new information. She had not known about Warren Elliott, and the blank space where knowledge should have been made the back of her neck prickle in the particular way it did when she realized she had been working with an incomplete picture. The merchant bank, she said carefully. What kind of connection? Whitmore isn't sure, but he thinks Voss wasn't just working a finder's fee on the Fairfield sale. He thinks there may have been a larger plan, the Fairfield land as collateral for some kind of financing arrangement, with the Philadelphia bank as the final piece. Louisa was very still. If the survey documentation was private, she said slowly, and the boundary records were in Voss's control, and the financing was structured through a bank Voss had a relationship with, then he would have had control over the property's valuation, its documentation, and its financing. Christopher's voice was flat. He wasn't just taking a cut on the sale. He was trying to position himself to hold leverage over the entire transaction. The full shape of it landed. She had known Voss was dangerous. She had known he was working a scheme more elaborate than a simple finder's fee. But she had not seen this piece, the financing angle, the bank connection. The way the private survey records would have fed into a valuation that a Philadelphia org accepted us without question because it was the only documentation they had. How much exposure would you have had, she asked. Christopher was quiet for a moment. Pryor is still working out the full picture. But his preliminary view is significant. If I'd bought the property on the terms Voss was moving me toward, financed it through the channel he was building, and then a boundary dispute had materialized. He stopped. The survey records would have favored whoever Voss needed them to favor. And the bank would have held instruments against the Aldridge land as collateral. The silence was very loud. He wasn't trying to swindle you on a land deal, Louisa said. No, he was trying to build a claim on Aldridge Hall itself. Christopher looked at her. That's Pryor's concern, he said. She sat back in her chair. In all the careful reasoning she had done, all the ledger entries, all the letters, all the conversations with Ruth Stover and her cousin in Richmond, she had understood Voss as a man running a sophisticated finder's scheme. She had not understood him as a man playing for the largest property in the county. She had stopped him. The supper had worked, and Voss had left, and the immediate danger was gone. But the narrowness of it, how close it had come to being different, settled over her with a weight she hadn't expected. I didn't see the full picture, she said quietly. You saw enough of it. Christopher pulled the chair across from her and sat down, which was becoming its own kind of habit, this new thing of sitting across from her in the sitting room as though the room had always been for both of them. Louisa, with what you had. I got lucky that Stover told Ruth when he did. Luck favors the people who are paying attention. He looked at her steadily. You have been paying attention for 8 years. That's not luck. That's you. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the ledger. What does Pryor want to do about Warren Elliott and the bank? He wants to document everything and send a formal account to the county recorder. Not a complaint, just a record, so that if Voss attempts something similar elsewhere in Virginia, there's a documented history. That's sensible. And Voss himself? He left the county 2 days ago. Christopher's voice had no particular emotion in it. Whitmore's man on the Sauna-Aunton Road heading north. He didn't say goodbye to anyone. Men like Voss never did. They arrived with good introductions and left without them and moved to the next county where nobody knew the previous one's story yet. She hoped Pryor's documentation would follow him. She suspected it would not matter enough. But that was not her problem to solve today. The Fairfield situation, she said. I spoke to Martha Fairfield Tuesday at the market. Christopher went alert. You didn't mention that. I wanted to have the full conversation before I reported it. She closed the ledger and folded her hands on it, in the way she did when she was moving from numbers to narrative. Thomas Fairfield's actual situation is this. He has a note due in February, not catastrophic, but real. Approximately $400 to a Harrisonburg creditor. The land isn't in danger, but the note is causing him anxiety, and Voss found him in an anxious moment and made it feel larger than it was. $400, Christopher said slowly. A manageable sum for a man of your position. Not manageable for Fairfield right now, given the season. She paused. I told Martha that Christopher had a genuine interest in discussing the western boundary situation, the Miller easement question. Not a sale, and that we might be able to offer Fairfield a straightforward solution that didn't involve selling anything. Christopher stared at her. What kind of solution? A grain storage agreement. You have the mill and the storage capacity, he doesn't. He has the western acreage that sits adjacent to your existing fields. An arrangement where he stores through your mill at favorable rates, with a fixed-term contract that gives him predictable income, would cover his February note comfortably and give you preferential access to his yield without the complications of purchasing the land at all. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a man encountering an idea he hasn't thought of and immediately understanding why he should have. He keeps his land, Christopher said. He keeps his land, his dignity, and his tenant agreements. You get a reliable storage and yield relationship with the western acreage without a single document that touches the Miller easement. And Fairfield owes you a favor, which in this county is worth more than a land transfer. She picked up her pen again. If you want, I can draft the terms and have Pryor review them before you approach Fairfield directly. Christopher was looking at her, the expression she was beginning to recognize as his, not the landowner's expression, not the decision-maker's expression, but the one underneath all of that. The one that was simply a man seeing something clearly and not wanting to look away. Yes, he said, draft the terms. She nodded and opened the ledger again. He didn't leave immediately. He sat for another moment. And she was aware of him there, the way she was always aware of things that mattered, not with the careful vigilance of self-protection, but with the simpler, quieter attention of someone who has started to allow themselves to want something. You were going to present this to me as a straightforward business proposal, he said. Not as you fixing something I got wrong. You didn't get anything wrong this time, she said. Voss manipulated a situation that was genuinely complicated. What you got wrong was before, when you didn't let me tell you about it. She glanced up briefly. We're past that part. Are we? He asked. Not with doubt, with something more careful than doubt, the tone of a man who wants confirmation of something he's not entirely sure he's earned. She looked at him directly. We're working toward it, she said. That's not the same thing as being past it, but it's something. He stood then. At the door he paused, and the pause had a different quality than his pauses. Before, not the hesitation of a man uncertain whether he's welcome, but the deliberateness of a man who has something to say and wants to say it right. Louisa, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the honest answer, not the careful one. She waited. When you sat at the wedding table that night and finished your supper, were you thinking about leaving? The question was so direct, so entirely without the protective framing she had expected from him, that it took her a moment to locate the honest answer underneath the 8 years of careful management of exactly this question. No, she said finally, I wasn't thinking about leaving. I was thinking about whether you were worth fighting for. A pause. I decided you were. But I also decided I wasn't going to fight for you in a way that cost me myself. So I started building something that would let me tell you the truth when the moment came. He stood very still. Worth it? She held his gaze. Ask me again in another year, she said. The answer is getting clearer. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more honest than a smile. He left. She sat for a moment with her pen above the ledger page, not writing. The morning light had moved across the desk to where his hand had rested on the arm of the chair. She looked at that for a moment. Then she began to write. The grain storage agreement with Fairfield came together in 10 days. Christopher approached Thomas Fairfield directly, without intermediaries. Without fanfare, rode to his property on a plain Thursday morning and sat with the man in his kitchen and talked to him the way men talk when they're not performing anything for anyone. Fairfield was a proud man. The kind of proud that made accepting help feel like surrender. And Christopher had understood with a sensitivity to the specific wounds of male pride that surprised Louisa a little. And then didn't. Because she was learning to revise her estimates of him, that the approach had to leave Fairfield's dignity entirely intact. He came back that afternoon and told her it was done. How'd he take it, she asked. He was suspicious at first. Thought it was another version of the Voss pitch. Christopher sat down. I told him my wife had spoken to Martha and had suggested the arrangement because she thought it was fair to both sides, and that I agreed with her. Louisa told him it was my idea, it was your idea. Most men wouldn't have said that. Most men don't have the particular motivation I have at present to demonstrate that I know whose ideas are whose. He said it without irony, which was what made it land. Fairfield liked it better once he knew a woman had proposed it. His words, not mine. He said women think about these things more fairly. I thought you should know that. She was quiet for a moment. How did he feel about Voss? Ashamed. Christopher's voice went briefly flat. Voss had told him the sale was the only option, that no landowner in the county would offer him anything else because his situation was too precarious. Fairfield believed it because he was frightened and Voss was convincing. When I told him what Voss's actual arrangement had been, the percentage, the private survey commission, the Philadelphia bank angle, he didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, nearly lost my father's land to a man who smiled at me every time we spoke. Louisa felt something cold and brief move through her. He's all right now, Christopher said, reading her expression. The February note will be covered by the first storage payment. Pryor's drawing up the contract, Fairfield's wife cried when he told her. She looked down at the desk for a moment, not from sentiment. She was not given to obvious sentiment, but because sometimes the scope of what might have happened needed a moment to be acknowledged before you could move past it. Yes. He paused. There's one more thing. The tone of his voice made her look up. Voss sent a letter. It arrived this morning. Addressed to me. He reached into his coat and put it on the desk between them. I haven't opened it. She looked at the sealed letter. Why not? Because I thought you should be here when I did. She held that for a moment, then she nodded. Christopher broke the seal. He read it once. Then he put it down and pushed it across the desk without speaking. She read it. Voss's letter was 3 paragraphs of precisely constructed grievance. He had been, he wrote, the victim of a misunderstanding orchestrated by a woman who had exceeded her position and misrepresented information to damage his reputation in a community where he had acted entirely in good faith. He intended, he wrote, to make his case known to those in the county who valued fairness over personal vendettas. He did not threaten explicitly. He was too careful for explicit threats. But the implication was clear. He intended to return the damage as best he could, and he intended to do it by targeting Louisa specifically. By suggesting that she had overstepped. By suggesting that a woman who had gone to the lengths she had gone to investigate a guest of her husband's house had acted improperly, regardless of what the investigation had revealed. She read it twice. She set it down. He's going to try to make the story about my behavior, she said. Not his, yes. Christopher's voice was entirely even. He'll say I interfered in men's business, that I manipulated information, that whatever I did to satisfy some personal interest rather than to protect. She paused. Some people will believe him. Some people. Enough to be uncomfortable. Yes. He looked at her directly. Does that change anything? She looked back at him. She thought about the sitting room in the first year of their marriage, when she had laid out the overseer's accounts and been told to leave the estate business to him. She thought about 7 years of ledger entries made in silence. She thought about the Thursday supper and Voss's careful face going still for the first time, and Ruth Stover's voice in the market, telling her what William had seen. She thought about what it had cost her to build what she had built, and whether the possible discomfort of Voss's version of events could reach back and unmake any of it. It could not. No, she said, it doesn't change anything. Christopher picked up the letter. He folded it carefully. He stood and walked to the fireplace and put it in. She watched it catch. "I'll be speaking to Whitmore today," he said, watching the paper burn. "And Daniel Marsh and Pryor. I want them to hear the account from me directly before Voss's version reaches them." "What will you tell them?" He turned away from the fire. "The truth," he said. "That my wife discovered information that protected this estate from significant harm. That she brought it to me correctly, that we acted on it together, and that anyone who suggests otherwise is welcome to review Pryor's documentation and form their own opinion." A pause. "And that I stand behind every decision she made." The words landed with more weight than he'd probably planned for them to carry. She stood up from the desk. "Christopher." "Yes, thank you." He shook his head slightly. "You don't need to thank me for standing behind the truth." "I know," she said. "I'm thanking you for doing it before anyone asked you to." The weeks that followed were the test. Voss's version of events did circulate, in the particular quiet way that versions of events circulate in small Virginia counties through drawing rooms and market days and the margins of church conversation, carried by people who were not malicious, but who found the story interesting and had not examined their interests too carefully. The version that traveled was not entirely invented. It was something more insidious, a reframing. The facts were acknowledged, but the interpretation was shifted. Louisa Aldridge had investigated a guest of their household, had gone to considerable lengths without her husband's knowledge, had presented her findings publicly in a way that humiliated a man in front of the county's most significant landowners. No one said directly that she had done wrong. They said instead that it was unusual, that it was strong, that it was not quite what one expected from a woman of her position. Louisa heard it through Eleanor Whitmore, who reported it with the brisk, no-nonsense manner of a woman who finds the opinions of other women more interesting as data than as social currency. "The Marsh cousins are saying you've been managing Christopher's affairs behind his back for years," Eleanor said, over tea, with the tone of someone reading a weather report. "I've been advising my husband on matters related to his estate," Louisa said. "That's what I said." Eleanor set down her cup. "They said that wasn't what they meant." "I know it's not what they meant. Are you bothered by it?" Louisa considered the question honestly. "I'm bothered that it will follow me," she said. "I'm not bothered by whether it's fair. I've known for 8 years that the things I know about this estate would look suspicious to people who hadn't seen me build the knowledge. There's no way to demonstrate 8 years of quiet work to someone who only sees the moment you use it." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Christopher spoke to my husband last week," she said. Very directly. "George came home and said Christopher had changed." She paused. "He said it the way men say that about other men, not quite approving, not quite uncertain. Like he wasn't sure yet whether changed was the right word." "What word would he use?" A brief smile. "He said Christopher seemed like a man who had finally started listening to someone smarter than him and wasn't sure whether to be relieved or embarrassed about how long it had taken." Louisa looked at her hands. "Both," she said. "So the answer is both." Eleanor nodded. "That's what I told George." The social murmur about Louisa died down in the way that murmurs do when they encounter a wall of consistent, unremarkable fact. Christopher's account of events, delivered steadily and without defensiveness to every person who mattered, was simply more credible than Voss's. Pryor's documentation, which he filed with the county recorder in early December, provided a permanent record that made Voss's version of events structurally untenable. By Christmas, the story had simplified into the version that would persist. Louisa Aldridge had seen a danger that her husband had not, had handled it with intelligence and restraint, and had been right. Some people found this admirable. Some found it uncomfortable. Most found it interesting enough to move on from, which was the most Louisa had hoped for. She was not trying to be a legend. She's trying to run a household that included now a husband who was beginning to understand what the household actually was. It was Christopher who changed most visibly, and it was the change itself that was the most complicated thing to navigate. He was by December asking her opinion before he made decisions. Not all decisions the field managed, The tenant negotiations. The grain contracts. Those were still primarily his domain. And she did not want them to stop being his domain. But the significant decisions, the ones that touched the estate's long-term position, he brought to her the way he brought them to Pryor, with genuine curiosity about what she saw that he might not. She was glad of it. She was also in the way of someone who had protected herself for a long time, cautious with the gladness. One evening in December, she was reviewing the December accounts when Christopher came in and sat down with the particular quality of arrival that meant he had something on his mind beyond the day's business. Daniel Marsh asked me something today. He said she waited. He asked whether you and I were his word was well. Christopher's mouth bent slightly. I told him we were better than we had been. He said he was glad to hear it, and then he said, I always thought Lucia was the best decision you ever made. I'm glad you figured that out. She looked up. She said no. He surprised me too. A pause. He also said he owed you an apology, that he had thought, at the time, that you were going to be manageable was the word he used, and that he was glad he'd been wrong. Louisa set down her pen. Manageable, she repeated. Yes, Christopher met her eyes without flinching. I think it was what most of them thought when we married. A woman from a smaller property, quiet, well-mannered. They thought I was taking a decorative wife. His voice had the flat quality of a man acknowledging something he finds unpleasant. I thought the same thing, not consciously, but I thought it. I know you did, she said, and I spent 8 years missing everything that was actually in front of me. Not everything, she said. You managed the land reasonably well. You made sound decisions most of the time. You were not a bad man. You were just limited in where you were willing to look. That's more generous than I deserve. It's accurate, she said. Both things can be true. You've said that to me. He looked at her. Something in his expression had the quality of a door that has been standing partly open for a while and is now opening further, not dramatically, not all at once, but with the steady, committed movement of something that has been decided. I want to be honest with you about something, he said. And I need you to let me be honest without turning it into something manageable, without making it into information you can work with. The request startled her, not because it was unreasonable, but because he had read her that precisely. All right, she said carefully. I have been afraid of you, he said. Not in the way of danger. In the way he paused, finding the words. You have always known more than you let me see. I knew that, somewhere, even when I was telling you to leave the estate business to me. I knew that you understood things I hadn't accounted for. And that frightened me, because I didn't know what to do with a wife who was more capable than I expected. She held very still. So instead of finding out, he continued, I made the distance comfortable. I told myself it was natural that you managed the house, and I managed the land, and those were separate things. So I made myself believe I was being reasonable when I was being cowardly. The wordly, she said, yes. He didn't look away. Not malicious. Not cold, cowardly. Because dealing with what you actually were would have required me to revise what I believed about myself, and I wasn't willing to do that. The room was very quiet. She looked at her husband. She looked at the man who had ridden away from his own wedding table and come back at 4 in the morning and found her waiting in the dark, and who had spent 8 years maintaining the careful distance that her own quiet had allowed him to maintain. He was not the man she had thought she was marrying when she was 22 and her father had told her he was not unkind. He was more complicated than that. He had more to answer for than that. And he had, sitting in her sitting room on a December night, found the words for his own accounting in a way she had not been sure he was capable of. She was quiet for a long time, I knew, she said finally. I knew you were afraid of it. I thought, in the first years, that if I was patient enough and useful enough, you would eventually stop being afraid of it. That you would just naturally, gradually see me. But patience can become its own kind of avoid. I was protecting you from the discomfort of knowing what I knew, because I thought protecting you from it was the same thing as caring for you. She paused. It wasn't. It was keeping us both stuck. He absorbed that. Voss, she said simply. Voss was going to take everything you built, and I realized that there was a line where patience crossed into complicity, where staying quiet wasn't protecting you anymore. It was just staying quiet, he nodded slowly. But you put down your spoon, he said. Put down my spoon. The December fire crackled. Outside, the Virginia winter was settling hard over the valley. And the fields were cold. And the tenants in the north were probably banking their fires the way people banked fires when they were trying to make fuel last. Thomas Louisa thought. 8%. A decision that would keep 4 children warm this winter. Small things assembled carefully built the architecture of something real. Christopher, she said, yes. Ask me something. He looked at her. Something I've been wanting to know, she said. Something you would have asked if you hadn't been doing the distance. Ask me. He was quiet for a long moment, thinking. What did you want, he said finally, when you were 22 before the wedding? What did you think marriage was going to be? She felt the question find something she hadn't expected it to find. I thought it was going to be a conversation, she said. That's what I wanted more than anything. Not a partnership in the formal sense, not shared management, not combined resources. Just a conversation. Someone who would actually want to know what I thought. She paused. I was very good at being quiet before you. I could hold a lot inside without anyone knowing it was there. And I thought that maybe if I found the right person, I wouldn't have to hold it alone anymore. He was looking at her with the full, undivided attention she had wanted at 22 and had spent 8 years building the conditions to receive. I'm sorry it took this long, he said. She looked back at him. But we're having it now. A pause. We are. Outside, the winter settled. Inside, the fire held. And Louisa Aldridge sat across from her husband and did not, for the first time in 8 years, feel entirely alone in her own house. January came, and with it the cold that settled into the Shenandoah Valley like a decision that had been made and would not be revisited until March. The fields were hard. The tenants banked their fire. And on the first Monday of the new year, Christopher Aldridge rode out to the north field and told Thomas Elliot, in person, that the rent increase would be April, not January, and 8%, not 15. Louisa knew because Elliot's wife came to the house 2 days later. She didn't send a note ahead. She simply appeared at the kitchen door. On a Wednesday morning, a woman named Clara, who had 4 children and a tired face and hands that had worked hard for every year she had been alive. Mrs. Patton brought her to the sitting room, which was unusual enough that Louisa set down everything she was doing immediately. Clara Elliott stood in the doorway and twisted her hands together and said, I wanted to thank you, Mrs. Aldridge. Thomas told me what Mr. Aldridge said. And Thomas doesn't know, he doesn't know that you're the reason. But I think you are, and I needed someone to know that it mattered. Louisa looked at her. It mattered to me too, she said. Please sit down. Clara sat, and they had tea. And Clara talked about the children the way mothers talk about children when they have been frightened for them, and the fear has just eased with the particular, relieved detail of someone who had been holding her. Breath and has now been given permission to exhale. The youngest had a cough. The eldest was learning to read. Thomas had been short-tempered since autumn, the way men got short-tempered when they were worried, and had no outlet for it, and the last 2 weeks he had been different. Quieter, lighter. He slept, Clara said simply. He actually slept. Louisa held her teacup and did not say anything for a moment because there was nothing to say that would be larger than that. When Clara left, Louisa sat for a while by herself. She thought about the ledger. She thought about 7 years of entries, made in the careful handwriting she had developed, specifically for documents. She did not want misread, precise, small, unambiguous. She thought about the night she had first opened it, in the 2nd year of the marriage, when she had understood that the distance between what she knew and what she was permitted to say was going to be permanent, unless she built something to bridge it. She had not built it for Clara Elliott. She had not known Clara Elliott existed when she started. She had built it because it was the only dignified thing she could do with what she knew, in circumstances that did not yet allow her to use it. But Clara Elliott had slept. Thomas Elliott had slept. 4 children were going to be warm through February. That was not nothing. That was in fact everything. She opened the ledger to a fresh page and began the January accounts. The first significant test of the new arrangement between Louisa and Christopher came in the 3rd week of January, and it came from a direction she had not anticipated. A letter arrived from Christopher's uncle. His name was Robert Aldridge, and he lived in Richmond. And he was the kind of man who had spent 50 years being the most senior person in every room he entered and had developed, in consequence, A complete inability to imagine that this might not always be the case. He was not malicious, he was simply impervious to evidence, to nuance, to the opinions of people he had already categorized as holding lesser positions than his own. He had, from the beginning of the marriage, categorized Louisa in a particular way. The letter was addressed to Christopher. Louisa would not have known its contents if Christopher had not brought it to the sitting room, unfolded, and placed it on her desk without a word. She read it. Robert Aldridge had heard about the Voss situation. County news traveled, and Richmond was not so far that it didn't reach the drawing room there eventually. He had heard specifically that Louisa had been involved, that she had apparently been conducting some form of investigation into a guest of the household, that she had confronted this guest publicly at dinner, that she had, in Robert's precise phrasing, taken it upon herself to act in matters beyond the appropriate sphere of a wife's concern. He was writing to advise Christopher, in the strongest terms, to clarify with Louisa what the boundaries of her role were. He was writing to suggest that while he understood Christopher may have felt the outcome justified the method, allowing a woman, even a capable one, to operate in this fashion set a precedent that would undermine the natural order of the household and invite future presumption. He was writing, in other words, to tell Christopher to put Louisa back in her place. She read the letter to the end. She set it down flat on the desk. Christopher was standing by the fireplace. He had not sat down. "You've read it," she said, 3 times. "I want to know what you think I should do." Not what she thought he should say, or how she thought he should handle it. What she thought he should do. She looked at the letter. "He's not wrong that I acted outside what he considers appropriate," she said. "He's simply wrong about what appropriate means, and he's wrong about what the alternative would have been." A pause. "If you write back and tell him that I acted correctly, and you stand behind it, he will be offended, and you will have a difficult relationship with him for some period of time. If you write back and tell him he raises valid concerns, you will have an easier relationship with him, and a much more difficult one with me." Christopher looked at her steadily. "That's not a difficult calculation," he said. "No," she agreed. "But it needs to be your calculation, not mine. I can tell you what I think. I cannot tell you what to value." He turned to the writing desk that sat in the corner of the room. He sat down at it and picked up a pen. "You don't need to leave," he said. "You can stay." She did not read over his shoulder. She did not prompt him or suggest phrasing. She sat at her own desk with the January accounts, and she listened to the scratch of his pen, and after 20 minutes he folded the letter and sealed it and set it aside. "What did you say?" she asked. "I told him that my wife acted with more intelligence and restraint than any man in the county would have managed, that she protected this estate from a scheme that would have cost us significantly, and that her method was not only appropriate but necessary." A brief pause. "I told him that if he had concerns about the natural order of my household, he was welcome to visit and see the order of it for himself, and that I was confident he would find it functioning very well." Louisa looked at the sealed letter. "He will come," she said. "Probably. He will sit at this table and be difficult." "Almost certainly. And you'll want me to manage it gracefully so that the dinner doesn't become a referendum on our marriage." "I'll want us both to manage it," Christopher said, with the particular emphasis of a man who is still learning a new language, but is working hard at it. "Together." She held that for a moment. "All right," she said. "When he comes, we'll manage it together." Robert Aldridge arrived on a Thursday in February. He was a large man, in the way that men become large when the world has spent 50 years agreeing with them, not physically imposing, but occupying space with the easy confidence of someone who has never had to justify the space he takes. He kissed Louisa's hand at the door with formal courtesy, complimented the house with the distant approval of a man who finds it adequate, and spent the first hour of his visit talking to Christopher about Richmond politics and the price of tobacco. Louisa managed the supper. She did it the way she managed everything, with precision, and without drawing attention to the precision. The food was excellent. The wine was his preference, which she had discovered through the simple expedient of writing to the Richmond household's housekeeper 2 weeks earlier. The conversation at table was kept comfortable by Eleanor Whitmore, who had been invited specifically because Eleanor had the gift of making any room feel socially navigable, and Daniel Marsh, who was Robert's contemporary and could speak his language. Robert Aldridge watched Louisa throughout the meal with the particular attentiveness of a man assembling a revised opinion. She was aware of it. She did not perform for it. She ate her food. She spoke when she had something to say. She let the supper unfold at its own pace. And when Robert asked her, directly, how she had come to involve herself in the Voss business, she looked at him with the same calm steadiness she had given Voss himself. My husband's affairs are my concern, she said simply. I had information that was relevant to his well-being. I used it. You conducted yourself in rather a public manner, Robert said. The tone was not hostile. It was testing. He was, she realized, a man who was actually capable of revising his opinion if the evidence was sufficient. He had simply not yet encountered sufficient evidence. The threat was public, she said. A private response would not have been enough. Christopher tells me you've kept detailed records of the estate's affairs for 7 years. I have. Without his knowledge. With his implicit permission, she said. He managed the land. I managed the household. The household includes understanding the land's financial health, because those things are not separate. Robert looked at her for a moment. That's a fairly expansive definition of household management, he said. It's an accurate one, she said pleasantly. A silence fell over the table, not uncomfortable but expectant. Christopher spoke, Uncle Robert. His voice was easy, but underneath the ease was the particular quiet steadiness that Louisa had come to understand was his truest register. I want to say something directly, because I think you came here to see something for yourself, and I'd rather give you the clearest picture I can. He paused. This estate is in better condition than it would be without Louisa. Not marginally. Significantly. The Voss situation alone, if she hadn't seen it, I would have moved forward on a transaction that Pryor believes could have compromised the Aldridge land itself. Not just money. The land. Another pause. I spent 8 years being too proud to understand what was sitting across from me at dinner. I'm not going to spend the next 8 doing the same thing. Robert Aldridge was quiet. The table was very still. Then Robert picked up his wine glass. He looked at Louisa across the table with an expression she didn't quite have a category for, not surrender, not approval exactly, but something more honest than either. The look of a man encountering something he hadn't expected and finding it, on reflection, admirable. Your father, he said to her, told me when you were engaged that you were the most capable woman he had ever known. I thought that was the ordinary pride of a father. A pause. I think I owe him an apology. Eleanor Whitmore made a small sound that might have been a laugh, quickly converted to a cough. Louisa held Robert's gaze. He would appreciate hearing it, she said. He's still perfectly capable of accepting an apology. The corner of Robert Aldridge's mouth moved. I imagine he is, he said. He stayed 3 days. By the end of the second day, he had asked Louisa, not Christopher, Louisa directly about the Fairfield grain storage arrangement. He had listened with genuine attention and asked 3 intelligent questions. On the third morning, he shook her hand at the door instead of kissing it, which she understood as the specific gesture it was. I was wrong about you, he said. I wanted you to know I know that. Thank you, she said. Come back in spring. The property is worth seeing when it's not frozen. He smiled, a real one, brief and slightly surprised, the smile of a man who has found something where he expected nothing. I may do that, he said. He left. Christopher came to stand beside her as the carriage disappeared. He asked me last night, Christopher said, whether I understood how fortunate I was. What did you tell him? I was beginning to. She glanced at him. Beginning to, she said. I'm working on the full understanding. He said it without deflection. It's a process. It is. Spring came to the Shenandoah Valley in its unhurried way, and with it came the particular energy of a property that has been well managed through a hard winter, and is now bearing the results. The Fairfield storage arrangement yielded its first return in March, a figure that confirmed what Louisa had projected, and gave Christopher the particular satisfaction of a man who has followed good advice and found it as sound as promised. The April rent adjustment went to the North Field tenants without complaint. Thomas Elliot shook Christopher's hand at the property line and said, "Fair dealing, Mr. Aldridge," which was the most Elliot had ever said to him voluntarily. And Christopher came home and told Louisa. And she filed the moment carefully, in the part of her mind where she kept the things that mattered. The ledger had been moved. Not by much. It lived now in the study, Christopher's study, in the locked drawer where the estate's most significant documents were kept. She had not suggested it. He had asked on February evening if she would consider moving it there. He had not explained why. He hadn't needed to. The request was its own explanation. The ledger belonged where the estate's real accounting lived, because for 7 years it had been the estate's real accounting. She had moved it herself the next morning and put it in the drawer alongside the prior documents and the Fairfield Agreement and the original Aldridge land grant that had been in the family since before the Revolution. It was the most quietly correct thing she had ever done in this house. By May, the first signs of something Louisa would not yet allow herself to call happiness. She was too careful a woman for that word, too aware of how quickly things that felt permanent could shift, had settled into the days. She and Christopher ate breakfast together most mornings now. He told her things before he decided them. Not all things, but the things that mattered. She told him things she had held alone for years, doling them out not to overwhelm but to build, the way you build anything solid. Foundation first, then the weight-bearing walls, then the roof that makes shelter real. She had not forgotten the wedding night. She did not think she would ever forget it in the way of forgetting. But it had changed in her understanding from a wound to a beginning, from a proof of his failure to the specific concrete origin of everything she had built. Without that night, she would not have kept the ledger. Without the ledger, she would not have been ready. Without being ready, the October supper would have been nothing more than a woman saying something uncomfortable and being thanked for her concern and then ignored. She had needed the 8 years. She had hated needing them. But she had used them, and that was the difference. The supper that marked it, the supper that she would remember as the one where the distance finally closed, entirely happened on a Saturday evening in May, without any particular occasion. Christopher had invited Whitmore and Eleanor, Daniel Marsh and his son, Pryor. 6 people total. The same people who had been present on the October Thursday, when everything had changed. Gathered now for no reason except that Christopher had said, over breakfast, "I'd like to have people for supper Saturday." And Louisa had said yes. And that had been the whole of the planning. The conversation was easy. It had the ease of people who had been through something together and come out the other side with a clearer sense of where they all stood. Whitmore talked about the spring grain prices with genuine optimism. Marsh's son had, apparently, developed a serious interest in land surveying, a detail that produced a quiet, shared look between Louisa and Christopher that no one else caught, but that contained about 3 months of history in it. Pryor allowed himself a second glass of wine and made 2 remarks that were for Pryor almost warm. When the main course came, Christopher picked up his fork and then stopped. He looked at Louisa, not the look of a man about to make an announcement or issue a correction. The simple, direct look of a man asking a genuine question. Before we move forward on the northern lease renewal, he said, quietly enough that it was between the 2 of them rather than the table. What do you think? The table. Eleanor heard it. Whitmore heard it. They heard it, and they registered it, and they continued their conversations with the particular social grace of people who understand that they have just witnessed something that belongs to the 2 people it's between. Louisa looked at her husband. 8 years ago, she had sat at a wedding table and listened to the horses disappear into the dark and made 2 decisions. That she would not be destroyed, and that she would not let him destroy himself. She had kept both decisions. She had kept them through 7 years of silent ledger entries, and 1 October supper, and a February letter from a difficult uncle, and 100 smaller moments that had not been dramatic but had been quietly the real work. She had put down her spoon. She had picked it up again. She had done it 3 times. And each time it had cost her something. And each time the cost had built toward this moment, toward a man asking his wife what she thought before he decided. Because he understood finally that what she thought was the most valuable thing in the room. The northern lease renewal, she said, her voice calm and clear, needs to reflect the water access improvement we made last autumn. The current rate doesn't account for it, and if we don't adjust now, we'll have a harder conversation about it in 3 years. Christopher nodded slowly. Figures? I'll have them for you Monday. Good. He picked up his fork again. The ease of it, the complete unperformed ease of two people who have found the way to be in the same room correctly, was more powerful than any declaration. Whitmore caught Louisa's eye across the table, the same small nod as October. She returned it the same way. Eleanor Whitmore, who had been watching this with the clear-eyed appreciation of a woman who had hoped for it for a long time, reached for her wine glass and said, to no one in particular, "This is a very good supper." "It is," Pryor said with feeling. The table laughed. Louisa picked up her soup spoon. She finished her soup. And across the table, and around the room, in the house that had always been hers to run, but was now at last a place she was permitted to fully inhabit, the evening continued. Outside, the Virginia Spring was doing what Virginia Springs always did, moving forward, insistently, without asking anyone's permission, turning the hard ground soft and bringing up everything that had been quietly growing beneath the frost all winter long. The Aldridge estate was 4,000 acres of the finest land in the Shenandoah Valley. It had a woman who understood every inch of it, and it had finally a man who understood her. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything that a marriage needed to be. Not perfect, not without its years of damage and distance, and the particular grief of potential wasted, but honest, clear-eyed, built on the one thing that actually held. Two people who had decided, each in their own way and in their own time, to see each other truly. Louisa Aldridge had sat at that table for 8 years before anyone asked her what she thought. When the right moment came, she put down her spoon, told the truth 3 times, and picked it back up again. She had known from the beginning that patience was not weakness. She had proven it, and she never had to prove it again.